Hi, my name is Lee-Anne Germanos, and I am the director and co-founder of the Embrace Project. The Embrace Project is an anti-gender-based violence and femicide organization. We are an advocacy group, and we basically creatively combat gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa. By that, I mean that we combine art and advocacy to tackle probably one of the most prevalent social issues in South Africa. We do that by selling art pieces that is generally and generously donated to us by South African creatives and artists. And what ends up happening is that we then end up giving the proceeds away from these art sales to beneficiary organizations, which are grassroots organizations that are combating gender-based violence and femicide in their own communities. That's the one leg of what we do. The second thing that we do as an advocacy group is we lobby government around implementation of gender-based violence and femicide laws and policies. And more than that, we also get involved in the creation of these laws and policies. We have made submissions to Parliament, at least 5 of them now so far, on legislation that impacts gender-based violence and femicide. We've also given our input on the national prevention strategy on gender-based violence and femicide, and we'll continue to be part of the engagement between civil society and government when it comes to implementing policy and legislation and genuinely advocating against gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa. We also get involved in strategic litigation. We will next year be launching a constitutional challenge to the definition of rape and consent in the Sexual Offences Act. And this is really where we make our greatest impact. We also have public education campaigns that we push through our social media platforms, which our handles are at the Embrace Project ZA. We push out bite-sized bits of information on the prevalence and the root causes of gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa. So it's little facts and stats about GBVF in our country. I think one of the things that we really need to concentrate on before we take a step forward when it comes to the fight against gender-based violence and femicide is we really first need to take a step back to see how it is that we got here, how it is that we're the most dangerous country in the world for women at the moment in 2021. And this was a stat that was really brought out by the World Population Review. We have the highest rates of gender-based violence and femicide in the world. So really the question is, how did we get here? And then only we can ask the question, where to from here? And I think in taking that step back, we have to remember that although we are a democracy, we're quite a new democracy. And before that, we had system on system of very oppressive regimes and violent regimes, really, that pushed that agenda in order to maintain control and a way of oppressing the majority in our country. And I don't think that we can forget that. And by that, I mean, we can't just imagine that all of that culture that's been cultivated over centuries in the country just disappears because we're now a democracy. During apartheid, and even before that, colonialism as well, violence and the threat of violence was used by the regimes, the apartheid regime, and obviously our colonizers, to oppress and also maintain control over the general population. And that is something that's really seeped into our communities and that remain in our communities currently. Those systems obviously created an unequal society. And in as much as we are now 27 years into our democracy, inequality is quite institutionalized in South African society, no longer on the basis of race anymore, but on socioeconomic inequalities built on previously disadvantaged backgrounds. So if we take that, if we take the inequality in our society and the fact that violence has never really left our communities, the way in which we police And those were really set up in a very specific way at the time in order to instill fear and punishment among the oppressed population. And that hasn't really shifted or changed. There hasn't been a genuine cleansing of the way in which we used to do things. And so if you combine those, is it really any surprise that we have such brutal gender-based violence and femicide crimes? And by that, I mean mutilations of not just females, but children as well. There was a report of a 20-year-old male who had got into an argument with another male and afterwards had walked into a kraal and beheaded that man's 6-year-old niece in her sleep. And this isn't even an unusual story in our society. This is quite commonplace now. And that in itself should tell us that there is something quite wrong. There is something, we're a bit of an ill society. And I think what we have forgotten or what we are not acknowledging is that we're still a society that's hemorrhaging from our past. We're really just a walking, living shadow of our past still. And it's in realizing that we can actually get to a point of addressing this issue. And addressing it isn't just through our criminal justice system, where you prosecute and you hope to lock up some of these murderers and rapists and abusers of all kinds. The real answer actually lies in the step before that, in preventing us from even getting to the point where we have to go through a criminal justice system process. So for me, the key is prevention, not punishment. So we've really got to shift our mindset from being a reactive society to a proactive society. We have to start from the bottom and remember that violence is actually a cycle. So perpetrators who grow up to perpetrate all kinds of heinous crimes and offenses of gender-based violence and femicide against women and children are often, in most cases, actually victims of violence themselves, who themselves have actually grown up in violent households where they may have been the recipients of such offenses, or at least witnessed it growing up. I think there's a small portion of the population who are just violent individuals just because that's how they are by nature. And I think Madiba was the one who said, you're not born hating. You actually have to be taught how to hate. That's not the natural state of the human condition. Mm-hmm. And it's in taking that step back that I would say probably one of the most important prevention tactics would be to implement some sort of curriculum at schools, at school level, to address these harmful stereotypes, myths, practices that have really sort of embedded themselves in our culture, whether it's, whether we call them cultural practices now or religious practices or community practices. I don't think that any of us can genuinely say that anything harmful is a part of our culture or a part of our religion. And I think it's in addressing those stereotypes, those harmful myths that have now embedded themselves in our society. It's only in addressing that we can really start to undo this very toxic and to an extent patriarchal narrative that has overtaken our society. And when we address it at the level of children, that is where you really ensure a long-term change, because it's those children who then grow up to be the adults of tomorrow and no longer the perpetrators of tomorrow. And that's just one section of the prevention strategy. Another thing that we really have to be cognizant of addressing is the psychological issues that are still quite prevalent in our society. I've just spoken about the heinous forms of mutilations that have really become normalized in our society. It's only in realizing that the greater South African society actually needs the help of psychosocial services, in the need for dispatching those kinds of services, particularly in violence-prone communities, is imperative. You can't just fix something from the outside. And even to some extent, those have not been fixed in terms of service delivery and addressing substantive inequality in South Africa. But there's also a need to address and fix the inner person. And I think that for very long, society in general has only ever sort of focused on fixing the physical. And there's always been a taboo around psychological support and help in many different cultures, and definitely in a society as conservative as South Africa. But I think it's only in really acknowledging the value of psychological healing that we can genuinely take proper steps and long-term steps to a healthier, better South Africa. And that's aside from addressing all of the other structural issues, like I mentioned earlier, the inequality, the substantive inequality that still continues, the fact that service delivery, basic service delivery, is still not actually being achieved in many South African communities. And it's those inequalities and the normalized violence that are actually still forms of oppression that exist within our communities. So in as much as we are liberated, I think we really have to ask ourselves, are we really? It's in realizing or recognizing that gender-based violence is about power and control, understanding the origins or the etymology of gender-based violence and femicide. The etymology of gender-based violence and femicide comes from a perpetrator needing to exert power and control over a weaker and more vulnerable victim, which is why they are generally women and children. And it's in recognizing this that we then also start being able to put together all the different pieces like a puzzle. So we come from this very disempowered past, where even in the present day, we remain disempowered because inequality is persistent. Violence is normalized. There is very little chance actually on improving on one's circumstances. And I say this because unemployment is at an all-time high. Levels of education are quite poor, particularly in public schools and in different more rural areas in South Africa. Service delivery and poverty are quite an issue, meaning that the nutrition that you need in order to be able to sit down at school and focus and have a good education is also lacking. So when you combine all of that and realize that the majority of South Africans actually feel quite stuck where they are, which then is also obviously exacerbated and explains why we have a substance abuse issue in South Africa as well, if that's your lived reality. So if you combine this feeling of disempowerment with the understanding behind gender-based violence, which is a matter of a perpetrator wanting and needing to exert power and control over someone weak and more vulnerable, then we have a complete picture of why it is that South Africa, as a society, has some of the highest rates of gender-based violence and femicide in the world.